Few stories in rock history are as emotional and complicated as the relationship between Paul McCartney and George Harrison. Their friendship began in Liverpool when they were just teenagers dreaming of music and a better future. Over the years, that bond would help shape the legendary Beatles, but it would also face tension, rivalry, heartbreak, and reconciliation. At first, Paul and George seemed inseparable. They shared a love for rock and roll, guitars, and songwriting. Paul, older and naturally confident, quickly became one of the driving creative forces of the Beatles. George, quieter and more reserved, slowly developed into a gifted guitarist and songwriter in his own right. As the Beatles became the biggest band in the world, cracks began to form beneath the surface. Paul's perfectionism and leadership style often clashed with George's desire for more creative freedom. George started feeling overshadowed by the dominant Lennon-McCartney partnership, while many of his songs were pushed aside during recording sessions. The tension became especially visible during the late 1960s. Recording sessions for albums like Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, The White Album, and Let It Be revealed growing frustration within the band. George increasingly explored spirituality and Indian music, searching for deeper meaning beyond fame and commercial success. One of the most famous moments came during the Let It Be sessions in 1969 when George openly confronted Paul in the studio. Frustrated by Paul's controlling approach, George responded with a now iconic line, "I'll play whatever you want me to play," or "I won't play at all if you don't want me to." The exchange reflected years of bottled-up emotions and creative tension. George's frustration eventually reached a breaking point. In January 1969, he temporarily quit the Beatles, calling the atmosphere unhealthy and unhappy. Although he later returned, the relationship between him and Paul had been permanently damaged. At the same time, George was writing some of the best music of his career. Songs like Something, Here Comes the Sun, and All Things Must Pass proved that he was no longer simply the quiet guitarist in the background. He had become a world-class songwriter. The release of Abbey Road in 1969 marked George's creative vindication. Something became one of the most celebrated songs in Beatles history, even earning praise from Frank Sinatra, who called it one of the greatest love songs ever written. Still, the growing success of George's songwriting created even more tension within the group. Paul struggled with the shifting power dynamics, while George continued to feel emotionally distant from his longtime friend. When the Beatles officially broke up in 1970, Paul and George followed very different paths. George focused on spirituality and released the monumental triple album, All Things Must Pass, while Paul launched his solo career and later formed Wings. Throughout the 1970s, their relationship remained complicated. There were moments of mutual respect, but also public criticism and lingering resentment. George openly admitted that he sometimes found Paul overbearing, while Paul quietly struggled with the painful comments George made in interviews. Despite the distance, their bond never completely disappeared. In the 1990s, time began to heal old wounds. Paul and George reunited alongside Ringo Starr to work on unfinished John Lennon demos for the Beatles anthology project. Songs like Free as a Bird and Real Love brought the surviving Beatles back together in spirit. Although creative disagreements still existed, the reunion showed a new level of maturity and understanding between Paul and George. They were no longer young musicians fighting for space inside the biggest band in the world. They were older men reflecting on a shared history that had shaped their entire lives. Sadly, George's health began to decline in the late 1990s. He battled throat cancer, lung cancer, and later a brain tumor. In 1999, he also survived a terrifying knife attack at his home. During George's final years, Paul became a quiet source of support. Their friendship softened, and many of the old resentments faded away. Paul later shared emotional memories of sitting beside George in a hospital room, joking together like they had as teenagers in Liverpool. One touching memory Paul revealed was that he and George held hands during one of their final meetings, something they never would have done as young men. That small gesture symbolized forgiveness, healing, and the deep brotherhood that still remained beneath decades of conflict. George Harrison passed away on November 29, 2001, at the age of 58. His death deeply affected Paul McCartney, who lost not only a former bandmate, but also a lifelong friend who had shared the most extraordinary journey imaginable. Over the years, Paul has continued honoring George's memory through interviews, performances, and personal reflections. Today, the story of Paul McCartney and George Harrison remains one of the most fascinating relationships in music history. It was a friendship built on admiration, competition, loyalty, frustration, and love. Together, they helped create timeless music that changed the world forever. And despite all the conflicts they endured, their bond ultimately survived fame, heartbreak, and time itself. Their story reminds us that even the most legendary partnerships are deeply human, filled with misunderstandings, emotions, and moments of reconciliation that matter more than success or fame.